You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Hi, everyone. This is Scott. If you want to learn about the world's oldest civilizations, find out how they were rediscovered, follow the story of Mark Antony and Cleopatra's descendants over 10 generations, or take a deep dive into the Iron Age or the Hellenistic era, then check out the Ancient World podcast. Available on all podcasting platforms, or go to ancientworldpodcast.com. That's the Ancient World Podcast.
Do you want to know where you can find almost 500 episodes of the history of World War II? Hi, I'm Ray Harris Jr., inviting you to check out my podcast, the History of World War II podcast, where I provide in-depth examinations of the key people and events that shaped World War II. While there, you'll also find interviews with authors who provide new and interesting reflections that help further our understanding of the conflict and the people that fought it. And a new episode comes out every week. And more history, that's always a good thing. That's the History of World War II podcast or worldwar2podcast.net.
Hello everyone and welcome to History of the Great War Revisited, Episode 8, the Anglo-German Naval Arms Race at its peak. After the very mediocre display that the Royal Navy had presented to the British Cabinet during the Agadir crisis, and specifically the failure of the Navy to provide the Cabinet with a workable and detailed war plan, it was clear to many that it was time for a change at the Admiralty. The First Sea Lord at the time, Admiral Wilson, had mostly just been keeping the tradition when it came to how the Royal Navy approached war planning. However, in the British Army, there had been a much greater emphasis on formal planning. This meant that when a crisis occurred, they made a much better showing to the political leaders, if only because it seemed like they at least kind of knew what they were doing. Wilson was instead only able to give some vague outlines. With such a poor showing at what seemed to be a crucial moment, it was only a matter of time before there were changes in the leadership of the Royal Navy. The first change would come in the form of a swap of the First Lord of the Admiralty, McKenna, and the Home Secretary, a person you may have heard of by the name of Winston Churchill. At the time that this change was made, it was not particularly popular. McKenna was well liked in the Navy, but the Cabinet wanted a more forceful political personality involved in naval affairs to hopefully provide greater influence over the actions of the Admiralty. Of course, if you want forceful personality, Churchill, he's the man for you. Along with this personality, it was also considered important that in the years before his appointment as First Lord in 1911, Churchill had been an outspoken critic of naval spending, and this was just one part of his own personal push for better control of government spending. And as soon as he took the job, Churchill became involved in even the most minute details of running the Navy. This is just how Churchill worked. When given the opportunity, he would give his opinion on anything, and during his time at the Admiralty, this meant weighing in on strategic and technical matters that were often not within the purview of the First Lord. In his defense, he was also very interested in becoming better acquainted with all the details, and he would spend time at sea during his first 2 years at the Admiralty trying to become acclimatized to what was happening in the Navy. This, when combined with a series of First Sea Lords that were not particularly forceful characters, created a situation where Churchill would have an abnormally impactful reign as First Lord of the Admiralty. But there were also other changes, because after his poor showing during the Agadir crisis, another change was almost certain, and that was the replacement of Wilson as First Sea Lord. This was also seen as necessary due to Wilson's resistance to the idea of forming a naval war staff. This resistance was a feeling that Wilson had shared with Fisher, his predecessor, but in the years after Fisher's retirement, the pressure for the formation of a naval war staff and for a much greater emphasis on formal planning and administration had only increased. There was not an obvious choice to replace Wilson, though, but Churchill settled on Sir Francis Bridgeman. Bridgeman had been a supporter of Fisher during his period of reforms and had been Fisher's pick to succeed him at the Admiralty. He may have been successful in the position of First Sea Lord, but he did not get along with Churchill at all, to the point where it greatly hindered their working relationship. The key problem was that Bridgeman firmly believed that the First Lord of the Admiralty was a position that provided oversight, but it should not be one that actively participated in the decision-making process at the Admiralty. Essentially, Bridgman believed that the First Lord should really only be there to check in occasionally, make sure things were in line with what the government wanted, but then to leave the real decisions about the Navy to the First Sea Lord. Churchill was not good at not being involved, or not giving his opinions, or not making decisions. He would do all of those things. In fact, he seems to have been fundamentally incapable of not being involved in things. To give an example of how this manifested in the Navy and why it was seen as such a problematic thing and created such resentment, let's talk about an incident that occurred in November 1913, which happened after Bridgman was replaced by Admiral Battenberg, but it's illustrative enough to consider. On the ship HMS Hermes, the first seaplane tender in the Royal Navy, there was a disagreement between the captain of the ship and one of his young lieutenants. During the disagreement, things got a bit heated, and according to the captain, the lieutenant told him that he would write to the First Lord who would sort things out. This comment, I guess this threat, was then reported up the chain of command and reached Admiral Sir Richard Poor, who then complained quite strongly to Second Sea Lord Jellicoe about it. When Churchill found out, he threatened to sack Admiral Poor. This caused Jellicoe to threaten to resign in protest of the First Lord's meddling in the business of the Navy. He also convinced the Third and Fourth Sea Lords to join him in this threat. The First Sea Lord also almost joined in the protest, but was talked out of it by Churchill. Instead, First Sea Lord Battenberg was able to bring the situation in hand and gave the lieutenant a good lecture, and the lieutenant was made to apologize to the captain and to the First Sea Lord and everybody else involved. Eventually, nobody resigned. But you can see the type of problems that Churchill's very hands-on approach would cause in the Navy when the wrong situation presented itself. Even the small comment from a junior officer of taking naval matters outside of the naval chain of command had resulted in a tremendous amount of stress and contentious discussions. After that incident, relations between Churchill and the admirals generally improved, and by the start of the First World War, he would be in a much better position than he had been in early 1913 or before. But there were some rough seas during that period. One of the key reasons that Churchill had been put in place and Wilson was replaced by Bridgman back in 1911 was so that a naval war staff could be created. This had the strong support of just about everybody within the political leadership. The plan was to set up something like the Army General Staff, which had been modernized in 1904, and in early 1912, Churchill converted the Naval War Council into an Admiralty War Staff. This was just one of several changes made by Churchill during his time as First Sea Lord. Now, you can criticize Churchill for many things during these days, but his desire for change was not one of them, and in these changes he was often advised by none other than Lord Jackie Fisher. They began a correspondence almost immediately after Churchill found out that he was about to move to the Admiralty, and on October 25th, Churchill would write, quote, "My dear Lord Fisher, I want to see you very much. When am I to have the pleasure? You have but to indicate your convenience, and I will await you at the Admiralty. Yours very sincerely, Winston Churchill." Now, Fisher was more than willing to get back into the game, and they would meet and they would begin a relationship where Fisher was the advisor for Churchill, and it was noticeable in many of Churchill's decisions. During these early years, they got along very well, with Fisher the aging agitator and Churchill the ambitious enabler. One of the decisions where Fisher's hand was at play, almost certainly, was around some of the lower deck reforms that Churchill would advocate for. He wanted to raise the pay, reform disciplinary measures while at sea, provide more leave, and just generally try and fix some of the promotion problems that still plagued the Navy. One unofficial Navy magazine would print, quote, "No First Lord in the history of the Navy has shown himself more practically sympathetic with the conditions of the lower deck than Winston Churchill," end quote. Such reforms were important steps taken by Churchill, which helped to solve some of the problems that the Navy was having, but it also helped Churchill to build his popularity among the sailors. With the Admiralty War Staff up and running, some of his reforms in the process of implementation, Churchill moved on to his next task, maybe one of the bigger tasks that he had been given when put into the position of First Lord of the Admiralty, and that was cutting costs. There was a general idea in the cabinet, and especially in the Liberal Party, which Churchill was a member of, that the Navy was wasting some of the money that was being given to it, and that the naval budget could be reduced. The wasting of money was a common complaint, with both the administrative abilities of the Navy called into question, while also criticizing their belief that more and more ships were needed to fulfill the Navy's obligations. Churchill was well known for his push for reducing government costs, which is part of why he got the job in the first place. However, when he arrived in the Admiralty, he did not follow through with any drastic cuts. Instead, he began advocating for increases, large increases. In this way, he would be next in the line of, sort of the long line, I guess, of British political leaders who criticized the Navy's spending from afar, but then when they were brought in closer, given more information, and began to fully understand the situation, switched from wanting to reduce the naval budget to wanting to expand it. One example of an area where Churchill did not reduce costs was around the construction of new capital ships. It would be under Churchill's leadership that the 1912 battleships would be designed. These would be the Queen Elizabeth class. They would contain some of the most famous British battleships probably ever, and many of them would see service in both world wars. Warspite, Queen Elizabeth, Valiant, all of these ships are very well known. And they would mount 15-inch guns and would be designed to make a 25-knot speed, which would allow them to keep up with the battle cruisers being built at this time, and would make them significantly faster than any other British battleship, or any German British battleship for that matter, that they would be facing. To achieve the necessary power to make this speed, they would have to shift from coal-fired burning to oil-fired, which allowed for a significant savings in machinery weight, while also had a better power-to-weight ratio. The switch away from coal also removed all of the backbreaking coal shoveling that would occupy over 100 men on some capital ships. Churchill would support this change, which was also something that Fisher had been pushing for during his days in the Navy. Fisher would say, quote, "The use of oil fuel increases the strength of the British Navy 33% because it can refuel at sea off the enemy's harbors. The internal combustion engine with 1 ton of oil does what it takes 4 tons of coal to do." End quote. Now, the shift to oil on the most powerful set of ships that the Royal Navy possessed also had important geopolitical ramifications, which were partially realized at this time. It was not just a matter of pulling up to a different fuel station, and instead had deep impacts in terms of how the Royal Navy could be supplied and how the fundamental need of fuel could be fulfilled. Britain had stocks of some of the best coal in the world for naval purposes, but it had essentially no endemic oil reserves. This meant that the Royal Navy now had to be concerned about stockpiling oil and ensuring that there was always a supply somewhere in the world that it had access to. To try and help coordinate the logistical problems of such a large shift, Fisher was brought back in and was asked to preside over a Royal Commission on Oil Supply. Now, the larger guns, the higher speed, the switch to oil, all of these were expensive, and this made the Queen Elizabeth class of battleship far more expensive than those that came before. But they were supported by Churchill, even though he had been put in place to cut costs. He was increasing them, even on a ship-by-ship basis.
Do you want to know where you can find almost 500 episodes of the history of World War II? Hi, I'm Ray Harris Jr., inviting you to check out my podcast, the History of World War II podcast, where I provide in-depth examinations of the key people and events that shaped World War II. While there, you'll also find interviews with authors who provide new and interesting reflections that help further our understanding of the conflict and the people that fought it. And a new episode comes out every week. And more history, that's always a good thing. That's the History of World War II podcast, or worldwar2podcast.net.
Are you earning and investing in the stock market? In real estate? How about in relationships? Are you earning and investing in your life? I'm Doc G, semi-retired hospice physician and host of the Earn and Invest podcast, where we have the 201 or next level conversations about money and life. Not only how you make money and grow it, but also how you use your wealth to create a better and more fulfilling existence. Join us every Monday and Thursday wherever you listen to fine podcasts.
While Churchill was being brought into the Admiralty to try and reduce costs, in Germany a similar reduction in costs was on the horizon. This was due to the planned drop in construction tempo from 4 to 2 in 1912. This shift from 4 capital ships per year to 2 had been planned since the most recent changes to the naval law in 1908, and so this was not a surprise to anybody. At the time, advocates for a larger German navy just assumed that when the time came, they could get the number brought back up to 4 through the introduction of a new Naval. However, this reduction in building speed was seen by many, and even some of the strong supporters of the German Navy in the Reichstag, as kind of a welcome reprieve. During the previous year, with the 4 tempo active, the naval budget was approaching 50% of the Army's, which was a lot. As the amount given to the Navy increased, resistance to those increases became more troublesome. This meant that the discussions around the naval estimates for 1911 were very heated, with the added problem of an election occurring during this time period, an election in which the Social Democrats, the strongest opposition to greater naval spending, did quite well. This initially convinced Tirpitz to change his plans. He had initially planned to introduce a new Naval in 1912, which would address the reduction in tempo, but the growing political resistance to further increases convinced him, temporarily, not to do so. However, this more cautious approach would then be changed due to events around the world. The Agadir crisis and then the continued building pace out of London caused Tirpitz to once again begin considering changes in 1912. The seeming political failure of Germany during the Agadir crisis had the effect of increasing support for further naval expansion. For many, the crisis seemed to show that even with its naval strength at its current levels, Germany could be pushed aside by the other powers when events occurred outside of mainland Europe, and Tirpitz was prepared to take advantage of these concerns. Capelle suggested that the Naval should simply continue the 4 tempo forward through several more years, but Tirpitz was slightly more cautious and instead wanted just a 3 tempo. This would give the German fleet a theoretical maximum strength of 41 battleships, which would be about 2/3 as strong as the Royal Navy. It would also increase the spending on smaller ships, U-boats, and Zeppelins. As always, there was also a built-in large increase in the estimates for each individual ship to make up for the fact that construction was getting more expensive all the time. When Tirpitz presented this new Naval to the Kaiser, for the first time, he was hesitant to support it. The Kaiser suggested that the overall scope of the Naval be reduced, out of concern that in the original form it would fail to succeed in making it through the Reichstag. However, even when these reductions were made, it was still resisted by Chancellor Bethmann Hollweg. The Chancellor was first concerned that a clear 2-to-3 ratio with the Royal Navy would be too provocative and might prompt the British to increase their building tempo even more, which would put more pressure on the Germans to once again do the same. This was an idea that Tirpitz and Capelle generally pushed back on. They understood that Germany was reaching the edge of its abilities to sustain more shipbuilding due to budgetary size and public opinion shifts, but they also believed that similar effects were impacting the decisions being made in London. Capelle believed that if they pushed the British to a 5 tempo in ships, which would be required if the Germans continued building 4, then the British would be at a position of financial ruin. One of the reasons for this analysis was the belief among the German naval leadership that manpower would actually be the Royal Navy's greatest weakness. The German ships were manned by conscripts, but the British were paying twice as much for each of their long-service volunteers, and as the navies grew bigger, the amount that the British were spending just on manpower continued to double. But Bethmann Hollweg was not concerned about the British, he was concerned about the Germans, and he did not believe that even the reduced Naval would pass through the Reichstag and insisted on further changes. The eventual compromise was a shift from a constant 3 tempo to one that alternated between 2 and 3. This would be the bill that would be presented to the Reichstag on April 15, 1912. There was opposition, but the passage of the Naval was once more not in serious jeopardy, or honestly it never would have been introduced. But although he did not know it at the time, this would be the last Naval passed before the start of the war, and the last major political victory of Tirpitz's career. There would be several more proposed Navals before and during the war, which would have a similar form of the previous changes, more ships, bigger ships, better ships. However, with the cost of ships and crews increasing, Tirpitz did not judge early 1913 or early 1914 to be a good time to try and make these changes. And then the war started, and then there were more important things to spend money on. When the new German building tempo became known in London, the first idea was simply to build 2 more capital ships than the Germans each year. Churchill would propose to the cabinet a tempo that would see 5 or 4 capital ships laid down on the years that the Germans were laying down 3 or 2, just a simple +2 formula. This would allow for a continued 60% superiority in dreadnoughts in the years that followed. This estimate was then brought down just a little bit when the estimates were announced to the Commons in July 1912, with the tempo instead being 5 for that year and then a steady rate of 4 in the years that followed. This meant that the Royal Navy would, by 1920, have a fleet of at least 79 capital ships, 62 of them being fully modern dreadnoughts, this to match up with the 41 that the Germans were planning to have. What all of these conversations bring to the forefront is that it was clear in the last few years before the war that the German desire to continue to increase the planned size of their fleet was waning mostly due to simple economic realities, combined with the determination of the Royal Navy to always maintain their dominant position. However, the German Navy was now being assisted by actions around the world. As Tirpitz would say, quote, "Every warship constructed anywhere in the world, except in England, was ultimately an advantage for us because it helped to adjust the balance of power at sea." End quote. The most important actions by other countries was the construction of dreadnoughts, and in this, the Germans were specifically assisted by the Italian and Austro-Hungarian navies. By 1914, the plan was for the Italians to have 3 dreadnoughts in service, 3 more nearing completion, and 4 more on order. The Austro-Hungarians would also contribute several more to the Mediterranean. All of these had to be accounted for by the Royal Navy because the 2 countries were allied with Germany, and so a war with Germany seemed likely to lead to a war with Italy and Austria-Hungary. The plans for the 3 countries was to combine their fleets, with the Italian Navy taking lead in the Mediterranean. This, of course, did not end up happening, as Italy would join the Entente during the war, but before the war, the Royal Navy had to plan to meet the Italian and Austro-Hungarian threat. Due to the importance of the Mediterranean to the overall health and defense of the British Empire, the increase in strength in those navies was a major concern at the Admiralty. Before the construction of these dreadnoughts, the British could at least be comforted by the fact that while their newest and strongest ships were needed in the North Sea against Germany, they had plenty of older ships that were more than a match for the Austrians and Italians. This would no longer be the case by 1913, when the first of these Italian and Austro-Hungarian dreadnoughts would be taking to the sea, and this would force more German capital ships in the Mediterranean, eroding the Royal Navy's advantage against Germany. While both Germany and Britain had been escalating their building tempo in the years after 1908, there had been growing efforts to come to some kind of agreement that would end the runaway costs of naval construction programs. In February 1912, one of the last real attempts was made by the British to initiate some kind of arms limitation treaty with the Germans. At this time, British Minister of War Lord Haldane traveled to Germany to discuss the idea directly with the Emperor and Tirpitz. There was support for such discussions on both sides, especially in the political leadership on both sides of the North Sea. For example, Bethmann Hollweg supported these talks, as well as many politicians in London. The core of each country's proposal was that the British wanted the Germans to agree to a 2-to-1 capital ship ratio, but the Germans were adamant that they would not go below a 3-to-2. While these numbers seem relatively close together by themselves, for the German Navy, the difference between a 2-to-1 ratio and a 3-to-2 advantage for the British was the difference between their naval plans failing and succeeding. If they agreed to give the British a 2-to-1 advantage in capital ships, they would still be, by far, the second most powerful navy in Europe and in the world, but they would be unable to put real pressure on the Royal Navy. For the British, if they agreed to giving the Germans a 3-to-2 ratio, they would still probably be able to defeat a German fleet when required, but to do so might have disastrous consequences on their ability to project naval power in the years that followed. One simplistic way to look at it is that a 2-to-1 ratio was seen by Tirpitz and German naval leaders as an existential threat to the Imperial German Navy, while a 3-to-2 ratio was seen by Churchill and the Royal Navy leaders as an existential threat to the British Empire. The Germans also wanted the British to make a neutrality declaration, basically that they would stay out of any European war between Germany, Russia, and France. This was something that the British did not feel that they could do, if only because at this stage their connections to France and Russia were too strong, and there were many very vocal supporters of even stronger Anglo-French relations. At the meeting between Haldane and Tirpitz, the details of the 1912 naval law were also discussed, with Haldane being given a copy of its exact contents. But these discussions, they didn't end up really leading anywhere. When Haldane returned to London, he was quite positive about the whole experience and hoped that it was just the beginning of future discussions. When the experts at the Admiralty read through the contents of the upcoming novelle, they were quite concerned, not so much about the new ships that were being built, but about the increased state of readiness within the high seas fleet, because they would be able to simply maintain a higher level of personal readiness due to having more funding going to that area. The German 1912 novelle would be put to the Reichstag on March 18th, 1912. On almost that same day, Churchill announced the 1912 to 1913 naval estimates to Parliament, and he made it publicly clear that the primary threat to the Royal Navy was Germany, and that it was Germany that was targeted by the construction of new ships. The naval arms race had entered its final stage, with both sides acknowledging their biggest enemy publicly and beginning to gear up for a naval war. Next episode, we're going to take a bit of a break from this narrative, sort of this endless path towards war, and instead we're going to spend an entire episode looking at the British efforts to figure out some way to actually hit something with these capital ships, because as the guns got bigger, as the ships got faster, as the ranges got longer, it got really hard to actually hit anything.